Ladies and gentlemen, when you step into the world of markets, you quickly discover something most people overlook. Success isn't about predicting the future, it's about preparing for the unknown. The margin of safety is not a tactic. It's not a clever trick. It is a world view, a discipline, a way of moving through uncertainty with calmness rather than fear. It's the quiet acknowledgement that the world is filled with things you don't control, don't anticipate, and don't fully understand, so you must build your life and your decisions on a foundation that can survive the unexpected. Most people gamble because they confuse confidence with certainty. They assume that because they feel good about an investment, it must be safe. They fall in love with their opinions, but the world doesn't reward you for your feelings, it rewards you for your resilience. The margin of safety begins with humility, the recognition that you will be wrong, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, and the only way to endure those mistakes is to position yourself so they don't destroy you. A margin of safety is the difference between what something is worth and what you pay for it, financially, emotionally, strategically. But deeper than that, it's the distance between your vulnerability and your destruction. It is the buffer that keeps you alive when the environment shifts. It is the space that absorbs shocks. It is the protection against your own blind spots. People misunderstand risk. They think risk is volatility or price movement. But real risk is the possibility of permanent loss. So your job is not to avoid movement. Your job is to avoid ruin. You build your decisions on probabilities, but you protect yourself with buffers. You don't stretch for maximum returns. You stretch for maximum survivability. Because wealth doesn't belong to the clever or the daring, it belongs to those who endure. Think of it like engineering. You wouldn't build a bridge exactly strong enough to hold the weight of the cars crossing it. You would build it to withstand storms, earthquakes, corrosion, and the unexpected. That's how you must build your financial life. You structure your portfolio, your savings, your leverage, your exposure, so that even when the world throws chaos at you, the structure holds. There's a simple truth. The higher the margin of safety, the lower the stress. When you know you can withstand shocks, you stop reacting emotionally to market noise. You stop being manipulated by fear and greed. You operate from clarity, not turbulence, because you know your foundation is secure, and this applies far beyond investing. You need a margin of safety in your relationships, so miscommunications don't destroy trust. You need it in your career, so one setback doesn't derail your progress. You need it in your health, so small mistakes don't become catastrophic. In every important area of life, you either build a buffer or you expose yourself to fragility. The margin of safety is ultimately a philosophy of compounding. When you avoid ruin long enough, the upward forces of time begin to work in your favor. Small advantages multiply. Small protections grow into enormous resilience. That is the paradox. Conservative foundations create aggressive outcomes. When you protect the downside ruthlessly, the upside takes care of itself. So when you move in markets or in life, don't ask, what can I gain? Ask, what can I afford to lose? Don't ask, how confident am I? Ask, how wrong can I be and still survive? Don't ask, how do I maximize returns? Ask, how do I maximize endurance? Because in the long run, the winners aren't the heroes who take reckless bets. They are the ones who stay in the game long enough to let time, discipline, and compounding do the heavy lifting. They are the ones who understand that resilience is more powerful than brilliance, that safety is more profitable than aggression, and that the strongest position is not the one with the highest potential upside, but the one that can never be wiped out. Build your foundation with care, live with buffers, operate with humility, and always, always protect your downside. The margin of safety is the quiet force that transforms longevity into greatness. When you look at the world through the lens of reality rather than emotion, You begin to understand that preparation is far more powerful than prediction. Most people walk into markets with the belief that if they can just analyze enough, study enough, or feel confident enough, they can forecast what's coming next. But the truth is, the future doesn't bend itself to your opinions. It doesn't reward your confidence. It doesn't care how certain you feel. The forces that move markets, economies, and even your personal life are far too complex to be predicted consistently. And once you accept that, you realize that your real advantage lies not in forecasting the future, but in preparing yourself for the range of possibilities that could unfold. There's a certain peace that comes when you let go of the illusion of control. When you stop trying to force certainty into an uncertain world, you begin to focus on what actually matters. Positioning. You ask different questions. Instead of what's going to happen, you ask what could happen and how prepared am I for each scenario. That shift in thinking is where real power begins, because preparation is something you can control. Prediction isn't. Every decision you make becomes stronger when it's built on this principle. Instead of relying on a single outcome, you build a framework that can survive multiple outcomes. Instead of betting heavily on one thesis being right, you create a structure that allows you to succeed even if your thesis is only partially right or completely wrong. That is the essence of a margin of safety. It's the discipline of acknowledging that the world is uncertain and making sure you can thrive anyway. People often seek the thrill of being right. They want the validation of calling the top or the bottom, of catching the perfect trend, of timing the perfect trade. But the problem is that these victories, as exciting as they are temporary. They feed the ego. They make you feel smart, but they don't build long-term wealth. The people who survive and prosper in markets aren't the ones with the most accurate predictions. They're the ones who structure their decisions so that even when the unpredictable happens, they remain intact. Preparation is a quieter kind of strength. It's not flashy. It's not dramatic. It doesn't give you the rush of being right, but it gives you something far more valuable: durability. When you operate with a margin of safety, setbacks don't knock you off course. Mistakes don't destroy you. Surprises don't destabilize you. You're not trying to avoid being wrong. You're trying to avoid being ruined. And that difference changes everything. Once you truly internalize this, you begin to see the world differently. You focus less on short-term moves and more on long-term positioning. You stop chasing perfection and start building resilience. You stop fighting uncertainty and start embracing it, because you understand that the future doesn't belong to the people who guess the best. It belongs to the people who prepare the best. And preparation, not prediction, is what keeps you in the game long enough for compounding, discipline, and time to work in your favor. That is where real wealth comes from. That is where real power is built. Humility is one of the most underrated strengths in life and in markets, yet it is the foundation upon which all sound decision-making is built. When you operate without humility, you're essentially saying you see everything clearly, you understand every variable, and your perspective is complete. But the world is far too complex for any single mind to grasp fully. There are forces at play that you're unaware of, biases that distort your perception, and blind spots you don't even know exist. Humility is not weakness, it is the recognition of reality. And accepting reality is the first step toward making decisions that actually work. When you admit that you can be wrong, you open the door to building systems that protect you from the consequences of being wrong. That's where the margin of safety begins. Humility makes you ask the questions that a prideful mind refuses to ask. What am I missing? Where could I be mistaken? What assumptions am I relying on? How fragile is my position if I'm wrong? These questions aren't about pessimism. They're about protection. They force you to stress test your ideas instead of falling in love with them. Most people become attached to their beliefs. They confuse confidence with correctness. They think certainty is strength, but certainty is often an illusion created by the mind to avoid discomfort. Reality doesn't bend itself to your convictions. Markets don't reward arrogance. Life doesn't hand out safety just because you believe you deserve it. The world rewards adaptability, awareness, and resilience, qualities you can only develop through humility. When you operate with true humility, you stop seeking validation and start seeking truth. You become more interested in being effective than being right. You're willing to examine your mistakes. You're willing to change your mind. You're willing to challenge your assumptions. That mindset is what allows you to build decisions that work in the real world rather than in the world you want to believe exists. Humility doesn't make you timid. It makes you strategic. It allows you to position yourself with buffers, to prepare for downside risks, and to avoid overextending yourself. Rather than assuming everything will go according to plan, you design your plan to survive the moments when things don't. And those moments always come. In markets, in business, in relationships, in health. Unexpected challenges are inevitable. Humility allows you to anticipate that unpredictability and fortify yourself against it. This is what creates durability. A person who lacks humility stands tall but brittle, vulnerable to the first storm that comes their way. A person grounded in humility bends, absorbs, adjusts, and survives. Over time, survival becomes the key ingredient of success. When you endure long enough, compounding begins to reward you in ways that prediction and bravado never could. Humility also builds better decision-making because it allows you to learn from others. You stop assuming you have all the answers. You begin to collect perspectives, stress-test ideas, and incorporate wisdom beyond your own experience. You're not threatened by disagreement. You're improved by it. That's how your thinking becomes sharper, more refined, and more aligned with reality. Ultimately, humility is the engine of growth. It is the force that keeps you grounded, the mindset that keeps you cautious, and the discipline that prevents you from taking risks that could destroy you. It keeps your ego in check, your thinking open, and your decisions anchored in truth rather than illusion. And because of that, humility becomes one of the strongest competitive advantages you can ever develop. Most people misunderstand what risk truly is. They look at the noise, the daily price swings, the volatility, and they assume that this movement represents danger. But volatility is not the enemy. Noise is not the threat. What you should really fear is permanent loss, the kind of damage that you cannot recover from, the type that removes you from the game entirely. That is the real definition of risk. And once you internalize that, your entire approach to decision-making begins to change. Permanent loss comes from overconfidence, from overexposure, from ignoring the possibility that you might be wrong. It comes from stretching too far in pursuit of upside without protecting the downside. People chase returns, they chase trends, they chase narratives, and in doing so, they expose themselves to fragility they don't see until it's too late. The irony is that most people lose not because the world is unpredictable, but because they fail to respect that unpredictability. They structure their decisions as if the future owes them smooth outcomes. When you recognize that the real risk is irreversible damage, your priorities shift. You stop thinking about maximizing returns and start thinking about maximizing survival. You begin to build your positions in a way that shields you from catastrophic outcomes. You understand that if you can stay in the game, if you can protect your ability to keep compounding, almost everything else takes care of itself. Staying alive becomes the strategy. This mindset requires discipline. It requires the willingness to sacrifice short-term excitement for long-term endurance. When you stop reacting to volatility as if it's a threat, you gain clarity. You stop panicking at temporary declines. You stop becoming euphoric at temporary rises. You see movement for what it is, part of the natural rhythm of markets and life. What truly matters is whether the moves you make can cause lasting damage or whether they allow you to recover, adapt, and grow. Protecting yourself from permanent loss means building in buffers, diversifying intelligently, and avoiding concentration that could wipe you out. It means not letting any single decision, any single investment, or any single belief have the power to destroy you. People often fall because they bet everything on one idea, one stock, one strategy, one outcome, but the world doesn't reward rigidity, it punishes it. The world rewards those who structure their lives so that even in the worst case scenarios, they remain intact. This principle extends beyond investing. In relationships, permanent loss comes from broken trust that can't be repaired. In health, it comes from neglect that leads to irreversible decline. In business, it comes from taking on burdens you can't sustain. Everywhere you look, the real threats are the ones that collapse your foundation. Once the foundation breaks, every other strength becomes irrelevant. The smartest individuals aren't those who avoid all losses. They are the ones who avoid the kind of losses that end their progress. They accept that mistakes will happen, that setbacks are inevitable, and that volatility is unavoidable. But they design their system so that none of those bumps in the road become fatal. When your primary focus becomes avoiding permanent loss, you begin to build a life and a strategy that is durable, adaptable, and resilient. You stop seeking perfection and start seeking longevity. You stop chasing excitement and start chasing endurance. And over time, that endurance becomes your greatest advantage, because no matter how volatile the world becomes, the one who survives is the one who eventually wins. When you build buffers into your decisions, when you create space between yourself and the edge, you gain something that most people never experience: emotional freedom. A margin of safety doesn't just protect your finances, it protects your mind. It shields you from the turbulence that destroys clarity, the stress that leads to impulsive decisions, and the fear that blinds you to long-term truth. When you have room to absorb mistakes, you start thinking more rationally, more independently, and more calmly. This is one of the greatest advantages you can create for yourself. Most people live on the edge without even realizing it. They stretch themselves financially to the limit. They overinvest in a single idea. They tie their identity to being right. They operate with no cushion. So when the unexpected hits, as it always does, they panic. Their emotions take control. They become reactive rather than strategic. They start making decisions out of fear, not out of principle. And once fear becomes the driver, the quality of their choices collapses. A margin of safety is the antidote to emotional volatility. It gives you breathing room. It allows you to step back during stressful moments and see reality without being overwhelmed by it. It creates psychological stability. When you know you can withstand shocks, you stop fearing them. When you know you won't be wiped out by a mistake, you stop hiding from the truth. That's when your decision-making becomes sharper, cleaner, and more grounded. This calmness doesn't come from blind optimism. It comes from preparation. It comes from designing your systems so well that even chaos cannot break them. When you diversify correctly, when you avoid over-leveraging, when you size your positions properly, you create a foundation that can withstand storms. And a strong foundation removes the emotional noise that leads most people astray. Clarity is a powerful advantage. The ability to think independently without being swayed by crowd psychology is rare. But clarity only emerges when the mind is not under threat. If you're constantly worried about losing everything, you can't think long term. If you're fighting for survival, you can't see the bigger picture. Your brain becomes trapped in short-term emotional loops. A margin of safety breaks that cycle. It gives you the confidence to stay disciplined when others lose their balance. It allows you to act from principles instead of impulses. And this principle extends far beyond investing. In relationships, a margin of safety gives you room for misunderstanding without collapse. In career decisions, it gives you the freedom to take strategic risks without risking ruin. In health, it means maintaining habits that keep you resilient even when things go wrong. In every area of life, the more margin you build, the more clearly you can operate. Ultimately, a margin of safety is about peace of mind. It's about operating from strength rather than from fear. It's about knowing that even when the environment becomes uncertain, your stability remains intact, and when your mind is calm, your decisions improve. When your decisions improve, your outcomes improve, and when your outcomes improve, the compounding effect begins to work in ways that transform your entire trajectory. Calmness is not the result of a smooth life, it is the result of a strong structure. And that structure is built by the discipline of creating a margin of safety in everything that matters. The margin of safety is not limited to investing. It is a universal principle that governs every meaningful part of life. Once you understand that uncertainty is everywhere, you start to see how essential it is to build buffers in every domain, not just in your portfolio, because fragility is not confined to money. Fragility exists in your relationships, your health, your career, your routines, your habits, and your emotional landscape. Everywhere you look, you're either building resilience or exposing yourself to unnecessary vulnerability. And many people only realize this when it's too late. Think about relationships. Strong relationships aren't defined by the absence of conflict. They're defined by the presence of resilience. A margin of safety in a relationship is the trust, communication, and goodwill built over time that absorbs misunderstandings and mistakes. If everything collapses the moment something goes wrong, it wasn't strong, it was fragile. Just like in investing, fragility reveals itself only when pressure arrives. The strength to withstand small cracks comes from having buffers, mutual respect, honesty, empathy. Without these, a relationship is like a financial position with too much leverage. One unexpected shock, and it breaks. In your career, the margin of safety is equally critical. You build it by developing skills that can survive industry shifts, by maintaining the ability to adapt, by nurturing a mindset that learns rather than resists change. People who rely on a single talent, a single employer, or a single source of income create the same type of vulnerability that a concentrated investor creates. One disruption can destabilize their entire life. But those who build a broad base of capabilities, experiences, and connections, those who diversify their competencies, gain optionality. They gain the freedom to move, to pivot, to reinvent themselves when necessary. That freedom is their margin of safety. Your health is another area where the principle is undeniable. You don't wait for a crisis to start caring for your body. You build daily habits, nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress management, that act as buffers against the inevitable hardships of life. A strong body and mind provide protection in ways that money never can. Without health, every other advantage becomes fragile. Your physical resilience becomes a form of compounding, small, consistent efforts that build a long-term buffer against irreversible decline. Even your emotional life needs a margin of safety. If your sense of worth depends solely on external validation, the world will control your stability. If your self-esteem swings with every opinion, every outcome, every short-term failure, you will live in constant emotional volatility. But when you build internal foundations, self-honesty, self-awareness, personal principles, you create psychological buffers. You become less reactive, less shaken by criticism, less thrown off by setbacks. You gain emotional durability, which is essential for making sound decisions, especially under pressure. By understanding that the margin of safety applies everywhere, you begin to live more intentionally. You stop assuming that things will always go smoothly. Instead, you build protection into the areas that matter most. You prepare for adversity when times are calm so that adversity cannot break you when it arrives. You create the space, the strength, and the stability that allow you to move through life with confidence rather than fear. The people who thrive over the long term are not the ones who avoid difficulty. They are the ones who build systems that can absorb it. They understand that uncertainty is not a threat to be eliminated, but a reality to be managed. And by applying the margin of safety to every part of life, they transform fragility into resilience, vulnerability into strength, and chaos into opportunity. Longevity is one of the most underrated forces in the world. People chase shortcuts, quick hits, and dramatic wins, forgetting that real success is almost always the product of time, and time only works in your favor if you survive long enough for it to do its job. That's why the margin of safety is ultimately a philosophy of endurance. It's about staying in the game, not for days or months, but for decades. Because when you protect yourself from ruin, when you avoid the catastrophic mistakes that remove you from the field, you give compounding the room it needs to transform small, consistent advantages into extraordinary outcomes. Compounding doesn't reward brilliance, it rewards consistency, it rewards discipline, it rewards those who understand that steady, uninterrupted progress beats the volatility of big, risky bets. People often underestimate the power of simply not losing. If you avoid the kind of losses that set you back 5 or 10 years, you automatically separate yourself from the majority. Because most people destroy their progress through overconfidence, emotional decisions, or chasing returns without considering the consequences. They break the compounding process just when it's about to reward them. A margin of safety keeps that from happening. It keeps you alive long enough for the upward forces to accumulate. It keeps your base intact so that every gain builds on the last. It preserves your ability to act, adapt, and recover. And when you understand how powerful compounding is, you realize that survival is not a defensive strategy. It's an offensive one. Staying in the game is the strategy. The winners are not the ones who hit the biggest home runs. They are the ones who avoid striking out. Think of anyone who's built lasting wealth, a strong career, or a meaningful life. Their success didn't come from one single breakthrough. It came from thousands of small, stable steps stacked over time. It came from the discipline to protect themselves during downturns, the patience to wait during slow periods, and the wisdom to avoid decisions that could cause irreversible damage. This is why the margin of safety matters so deeply. It shields the compounding process from being interrupted. Over time, the gap between those who protect their downside and those who don't becomes enormous. The person who survives downturns is able to reinvest, rebuild, and continue the journey. The person who doesn't protect themselves has to start over repeatedly, compounding nothing but frustration. That is the difference between fragility and resilience. Fragility cracks under pressure, resetting the clock every time. Resilience absorbs the pressure and keeps moving forward. This principle applies to more than just money. In your personal life, longevity in relationships comes from the ability to repair, to listen, to maintain trust over time. Longevity in health comes from daily habits that preserve your strength and avoid irreversible damage. Longevity in personal growth comes from the discipline of continuous learning rather than reckless certainty. Everything good in life scales with time, but time only rewards those who remain intact. So when you think about building your future, think about it like building a fortress. one strong enough to withstand storms so that you continue to stand when others fall. Because once you eliminate the possibility of ruin, once you remove the threat of devastation, you allow compounding to work unimpeded, and that is when the true acceleration begins. Endurance is not glamorous. It doesn't make headlines, but it builds empires. It builds freedom. It builds peace of mind, and it all begins with the discipline of creating a margin of safety that preserves your ability to keep moving forward, year after year, decade after decade, until time itself becomes your greatest ally.